Okay, I think we've been together all day. I'm John Stomberg. I'm the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961S Director of the Hood Museum, in case you haven't met me yet. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce one of our long travelers who has really traveled the distance to come to be with us today. Brooke Minto is the Executive Director, Zeitz MOCAA Foundation USA, and the Director of Institutional Advancement, Zeitz Museum of Contemporary Art, Africa. And she has been in these places that you keep ending up in these really amazing buzzworthy places. You know, it's kind of amazing. She was, before she joined Zeitz MOCAA, she was Chief Advancement Officer at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, and is Deputy Director of Development and External Affairs at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And each of these are like these places that have just come so far, so fast, and you've got to figure a lot of that has to do with your energy. So it's really a pleasure to have Brooke with us today. She's an 01, and happily we happened to catch her at a time when she was on this continent and able to come join us. So with that, I turn it over to our next moderator.
Thank you so much for that introduction, John, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I have been wanting to visit the museum since the expansion opened in January, and I was traveling, so I'm just really delighted to be back with everyone and to see this beautiful new space. So good afternoon. As I mentioned, it's a thrill to be back on campus this weekend and to have the opportunity to close out this special symposium with our selection of talks and panel today. For those of you who've been with us since last evening, you've made it to the finish. Congratulations. And for those of you who'll be joining us just now, you've arrived in time for a discussion that I think is absolutely top of mind for most institutions today, and one that we have heard threads of and references to throughout a number of the very thoughtful discussions since last night. The title of our session, Inclusion and Diversity in Museums, what does that mean? Aptly poses a question that many, if not most, or all of us here this afternoon are engaging and activating on a regular basis at our institutions. At the same time, we are asked to constantly sort of measure and message our success and our progress in these efforts. Before we begin, I thought it might make sense as a starting point and an effort to ground our discussion to offer some simple definition of terms as set forth by the American Alliance of Museums in a report published in 2014. This topic is vast and varied, and I thought it might make sense that we just, so we don't all get muddled up and confused in the comparison of the two, just have a sense of what we're talking about when we say diversity and inclusion as it relates to the work we do across the museum. So the AAM has defined diversity as, bear with me, it's a long definition, but the quality of being different or unique at the individual or group level. This includes age, ethnicity, gender identity, language differences, nationality, parental status, physical, mental, and developmental abilities, race, religion, sexual orientation, skin color, socioeconomic status, education, work and behavioral styles, the perspectives of each individual shaped by their nation, experiences, and culture, and more. And they go on to say, even when people appear the same on the outside, naturally they are different. Inclusion. While diversity exists always in social systems, inclusion, on the other hand, must be created in order to leverage diversity. An environment must be created where people feel supported, listened to, and able to do their personal best. Our talks and discussion this afternoon will attempt to address this complex query from various perspectives and in various contexts. At present, our panelists represent institutions from New York, Chicago, and Boston, and have advanced their work in several other cities across the US, as well as internationally over the last several years. To this end, our speakers will present a series of case studies, either work that they're personally engaged in or that of institutions who offer programs and projects of exemplar quality that we thought we'd foreground today. Through their presentations, we will consider how the current consciousness to issues of diversity and inclusion affect institutions of different size and mission, and how we think about diversity and inclusion with regard to museum leadership, our boards and our staff, how it relates to our collections and our exhibition programs, and how all of this impacts our constituents and our various audiences. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Tani, class of 2005. Ellen Yoshitani is an art historian and assistant curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, where she's presented the work of Nina Chanel Abney, Huma Baba, and is developing an exhibition with Shabalala Self for January 2020. Previously, she served as Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. At Bowdoin, she taught classes with the museum's collection and curated exhibitions including Second Sight, The Paradox of Vision in Contemporary Art, a major exhibition and publication that centered on issues of race and disability within histories of conceptual art. Her research interests engage the fields of American art, Black studies, race and ethnicity, feminism, design, and conceptual art. After Dartmouth, she earned her PhD in art history from Stanford University in 2015. In addition to regularly presenting her work at academic conferences, Tani has developed workshops and led object-based pedagogy. She's delivered guest lectures in interdisciplinary contexts. In 2018, she was invited to be the juror for the Maine-based publication, The Charts Visiting Critic Program. She's contributed to exhibition monographs of Charles Gaines and Sangnagunyi, and has written for Common Field, Apricot Journal, and online platforms such as The Chart, Temporary Art Review, and Art Practical. How about I just maybe stop there? I could go on. There are many journals listed here. Please join me in welcoming Ellen as our first speaker.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for surviving a long, long day. I know this is the tired time of the day, so I hope everybody's excited to talk about diversity. I wanted to echo everybody else's thanks. It's really nice to be back here at the museum, which is radically different than it was when I was a student here. And I'm going to not deliver any kind of written prepared talk, but just speak about some issues that I find really interesting right now in the ongoing conversations around diversity and inclusion in museums that have to do with content and with culture within institutions. But first, I want to start with a little bit of a bio. I didn't know what art history was when I came to college, but I was fortunate enough to have Ellen Hockley as my freshman year advisor, who helped guide my early choices for classes to take and enroll in. And so he conned me into becoming an art history major and then became my thesis advisor and let me write about paper lamps. So I am grateful to him for his unwavering support and refreshingly salty demeanor occasionally, and for helping me understand the tools I need to survive as an art historian and as a graduate student, which would be distance running and caffeine. So thank you to Alan. And to the other faculty who shaped my early vision around how we read the world. In graduate school, I scratched the itch that had started in college and enrolled in a department that didn't have anybody who worked actually on what I wanted to study, which was Asian American art. And so I ended up moving outside of the art history department, partly because I had a fellowship in comparative studies in race and ethnicity, which is this kind of think tanky institute at Stanford. But that really helped me understand what race is as an idea, how it operates within a sociological, political, philosophical context, and helped me develop a set of tools that I could then employ in my teaching, in my research, and my writing, and something that I wish that we could all do as a mandatory part of our curriculum. But it expanded my worldview greatly, and after I finished, I taught at this very small liberal arts college with a wonderful gem of an art museum at Bowdoin in Maine, and I spent a lot of time in this classroom with pulling objects from storage to put up on the rails, working with a collection that was established in 1811 and is huge and was very, very active and engaged and hands-on with student life, and was able to be, because we were a small institution and I had a lot of autonomy and responsibility, was able to be really agile and responsive, had a lot of freedom, really enjoyed that, and was forced to step beyond my expertise constantly, every day. Very rarely was I able to land in my comfort zone. So I learned about how to be very adaptable at that institution, where I was for 3 years, and then I went to this big museum at the ICA Boston, where I've been for the last year and a half, which has a collection of 320-some objects. It's a 21st century collection, which means that it is unburdened by many of the complexities of more historical collections, and presents a great opportunity for us to think freely about how we want to shape it with the perspectives that we have right now. So it also serves a huge public, and I don't have as much interaction with students, and I can't be as adaptable in my own work, and I don't have as much autonomy there, but it is a really large platform and a very exciting place to be. And I've learned a lot there about what it means to take on the challenge of connecting with an audience, to discover your relevance as an institution, how to measure the efficacy of your strategies. And I'll talk a little bit about how we have at the ICA tackled some questions around diversity and what the challenges are there. But I want to open with a little bit of a case study, which is the strategic use of deaccessioning policies to diversify collections. So this has been in the news in the last year, thinking about what's on the walls. So who's represented in the collection? Of course, many museums deploy exhibition programming to take shows, and they'll put up works on a temporary basis, but that do address concerns around diversity and inclusion and do represent populations that are underrepresented in the collection. But then what is the legacy of what you build for the future, and how do you reflect your community in a given moment? So 3 pretty radical proposals came up in the last year from SF MoMA, from the Baltimore Museum of Art, and from the Art Gallery of Ontario, all of whom deaccessioned high-value works from their collection in order to acquire new works with the explicit purpose of diversifying the collection. And I want to think about this both in terms, and I would love to hear what other people's thoughts about what this means in terms of optics and investment, and can this work ever be complete? But this is the case of SF MoMA, which deaccessioned a Mark Rothko painting, which is hanging in the galleries upstairs. Very exciting. And with the sale of this artwork, they were able to buy 11 new artworks. They divided the proceeds into an acquisition fund that could be used quickly, an endowment fund that would ensure the sustainability of their endeavor to diversify their collection. They have said that this is the first step in what the fund will allow the museum to do, so there is an intention for more than just building the collection, I think, in terms of how this funding can apply to the museum's diversity work. But again, it was intended to fill historical gaps. The next case study is the Baltimore Museum of Art, and this gesture was a bit more polemical. The director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, Chris Bedford, describes the fund that would be built by deaccessioning as a war chest. And think about it in terms of Baltimore. This is a city that's majority Black, 60%, very embedded in recent histories of racial violence. A city that whose civic institutions need to be responsible and responsive in these ways. And so he deaccessioned a number of works. Sorry, my flowcharts, are they okay? Because certain funds from certain sales were earmarked for, again, an available acquisition fund to be spent more immediately, and then a longer-term endowment that would bear returns and draws on a more regular and sustainable basis for the future. And they have also, at the Baltimore Museum of Art, been really explicit about presenting an exhibition program that's really robust in representing diversity and also making acquisitions. So again, more than thinking about just the collection. A third case study is the Art Gallery of Ontario, and they deaccessioned 20 pieces by A.Y. Jackson, who is a really prominent figure in the Group of Seven, which is tied to Canadian modernism. And with their funds, they decided to, because A.Y. Jackson's work was in the Indigenous and Canadian art bucket in their collection, all the proceeds would be used to expand the diversity of that one facet of their collection. So rather than applying it to the collection at large, they intend to shape this one aspect of it and balance it out a bit more in terms of the representation within that area. They also pursued other initiatives that they said that they are piloting for the first year. So I like to think about these ideas of a more permanent kind of insurance towards ongoing diversity work and collection building, but then also testing out and implementing more experimental programs to see if they work, to diversify audiences. And so breaking down some of the barriers to access, so free entry, making it cheaper to become a member when you have a ticket. So again, ensuring that visitors can return again and again and have an ongoing engagement with their institution. But cultural and operational change is very slow. So I want to bring up something that I found on AAM's website, which was they published a book recently this year, and it was a republication of something that Lonnie Bunch had written in 2000. And he said, it's called Flies in the Buttermilk. Has anybody read this essay? You should read it. But he laments how, he's talking about how the conversation that was happening in the field 10 years previously in the mid-1980s, he said, despite more than a decade of conversation, we've failed to address adequately, seriously, and creatively the realities of a less than diverse workforce. And if we are to entice the best and brightest to our field, regardless of race, we must change our strategies, our culture, and our assumptions. So the idea here is that the museum's mission is not just caring for objects, but caring for culture. And I think the challenge that he identified in this article is that it came down to a matter of institutional will. Institutional will is easier to implement with objects than it is with people. So change in culture is glacial, moves at a glacial pace, and it also requires what he described as in-reach in addition to outreach. So a lot of attempts to engage with communities come in the form of programming and outreach, but he's arguing in this article for a very rigorous self-assessment of who we are and how we want to build our institutions. And I think that, thinking about this 20 years later, we're finally doing that in-reach work at a lot of different places and at a lot of different levels. So at the ICA, we really focus on pipeline. So paid internships, partnering with foundations, so the Ford Foundation, the Barr Foundation, they both fund internship development and pipeline programs. We have a Teen Arts Council that consists of a group of local teenagers, high school students who are paid, and they have agency in the museum as staff members, and they plan programs, and they really set the terms of engagement for their own community on behalf of the ICA. And this is a pretty interesting example. This image on the left is from a teen convening that we had earlier this year, which was all about teen arts education. So thinking too about how museum staffing is not just about people who have graduate degrees and who have titles, but it starts much earlier in terms of offering an authentic engagement with the institution. The other way we've been able to move the boulder at all, because we're having, I think, a bit of a challenge defining what diversity means, which I want to talk about later, is thinking about accessibility. So we've developed a small working group that's cross-departmental that has been testing and implementing different accessibility strategies based on identifiable needs that we have measured from visitor feedback. And this takes a lot of management and organization. It's slow and hard work, but it's also measurable and concrete. So we are sort of doing that work on a piecemeal basis, but it's the kind of work that pervades every department of the museum. And to do diversity work well, I think, is to not leave it in the hands of one staff member or a few staff members who optically represent diversity, but rather to infuse every area of the museum with that ethos and with kind of shared understanding of what it means to do that work. I think my time is up, so I'm going to leave it there. But just to conclude, I do want to think about how do we consider diversity work on an ongoing basis. I think it's very pressing right now for museums to address this, but what will diversity work look like 20 years from now? How can we not be in the position of looking back at somebody who's at the republication of Lonnie Bunch's essay from 2000 and feel like we haven't gotten anywhere? And also, how do we define our institutional voice in this regard? On whose behalf are we speaking? Thinking too about who's allowed to speak on the walls, whose voice is represented in the labels. And then the third challenge, I think, is how do we measure the effectiveness of our work in this regard beyond quotas of staff diversity, and how do we hold ourselves accountable to that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm looking forward to our discussion with the audience later to kind of further address some of the questions you posed there at the end. But moving on, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Max Anderson, class of 1977, who currently serves as president of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. Max Anderson has devoted his career to advancing the mission of nonprofit cultural institutions while creating best practices to ensure their development and sustainability. He has long sought to address challenges facing the cultural sector, from community engagement to programmatic relevance, transparent business practices, cultural property ownership disputes, operational efficiency, and the impact of digital platforms on communications. Max has served as a museum director for almost 30 years in Atlanta, Toronto, New York City, Indianapolis, and Dallas. So I think amongst the four of us, we've got the whole nation covered, east to west. Please join me in welcoming Max to the podium.
Thank you, Brooke, very much, and so happy to be back in Hanover, and very grateful to John Stomberg and his team for making us all feel so welcome and looked after. And like most of the speakers, I'm here in tribute to the professoriate, and John Connolly was teaching contemporary art when I was here, and Matthew Winke was teaching Greek and Roman art, and the redoubtable Joy Kenseth was teaching European art, and so grateful to see you here, Joy. There weren't museum internships when Jeannie Roston and President Hanlon and I, 3 classmates, were here because there wasn't a museum. But with the help of the art history department, I was able to cajole Jan Vandermark, who was running the Hopkins Center, to allow me to write labels for the college's art collection, which was astride the top floor of Carpenter Hall at the time, if you can imagine such a thing. But that experience and the experience of studying with these extraordinary professors started a lifelong passion for me and a desire to build awareness of works like those on Carpenter Hall that had been neglected by both scholars and by the art market in many cases. And also I developed excitement about challenging orthodoxies of various kinds, including the unfettered collection of unprovenanced antiquities, the profligate carbon footprints of museums, and the unchecked commercialization of the museum profession at large. My first job after getting a doctorate at Harvard in art history involved 7 years in Sean Hemingway's department, in the Greek and Roman department, and there became fully aware of the challenges associated with collecting and making antiquities relevant to people's lives. And then I started a journey of some 30 years, as Brooke mentioned, as a museum director. That first directorship was at Emory University in 1987, where I continued to focus on antiquities and organized exhibitions of unpublished material from the Louvre, the British Museum, the Museo Nazionale Romano in Rome, the Anthropological Museum in Mexico City, and many others, and developed an awareness of how much of the world's heritage was not visible. As a newcomer to the south in 1987, I also dove into the then largely unknown tradition of African American art from the Black Belt and traveled across Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, learning about traditions of visual art making, in many ways analogous to blues, but work that had never made its way out of the Deep South into the North, into the Great Migration, into the market. And it led me in time to develop an exhibition for the Centennial Olympic Games in Atlanta with over 400 works of art in a 15,000 square foot exhibit called Souls Grown Deep. It's derived from a Langston Hughes poem. And in 2010, that phrase became the name of the foundation championing that visual arts tradition. Out of habit, I kept running art museums, and I kept doing it for a long time, but I'd never neglected acquisitions and exhibitions of African American art from the South, as with a 2002 exhibition when I was director of the Whitney Museum of American Art called The Quilts of Gee's Bend, which was called by the New York Times as containing some of the most spectacular works of modern art produced in America. After leaving directing in 2015 at the Dallas Museum of Art, I found my way back to antiquities, and I wrote a book on that, a primer for Oxford University Press. But I also went headlong into the art of the Black Belt as president of this 9-year-old foundation, Souls Grown Deep. My board chair is a third-generation quilt maker, Mary Margaret Petway. She's a remarkable woman. She's an Alabama Humanities Fellow and a redoubtable leader herself for our remarkable foundation. Of our 13 trustees, I have another who was just arrested for the 3rd time. Her name's Jane Fonda. And Jane is a very strong believer in this material from her days living in Atlanta and collecting it as well. And so the shift from black tie dinners and showing trustees around art fairs in Europe to effectively working on providing economic opportunities for the families of African American artists whose artworks are in our care has been extraordinary. Yesterday, I got to Hanover on a red eye from San Francisco, where I had been on a panel at the Social Capital Markets Conference talking about another challenge which is facing museums, and that is the controversy around trustees whose wealth was accumulated in ways that are today thought to be untoward, like pharma, arms, fracking. And in the panel, I proposed, as I have written elsewhere, that the controversies around the sources of wealth are best addressed by having museum endowments themselves scraped clean of toxic assets and focusing instead on positive opportunities in the community at large, which our foundation has done at Souls Grown Deep. We focus on investments that foster job creation and affordable housing, among other causes. So as museums are grappling with a variety of challenges, certainly the obligation we're here today to talk about in the direction of collecting and hiring and board leadership of bringing in diversity is at the core. Not surprisingly, though, much of the effort by American museums in recent years to diversify has been focused on artists at the top of the art market, artists who are household names, artists whose works stand alongside in auction results works by white artists of consequence. And that's not our focus. Last year, ArtNet did a survey of the shows and acquisitions of leading US museums, and it showed that the diversity quest has materially benefited fewer than 20 artists of color. And it's great that those artists are receiving their due, but our mission at Souls Grown Deep is to broaden the canon of American art history beyond the validation of the art market. Almost all of the 160 artists represented in our collection were born in poverty and died in poverty. They were neglected because they weren't part of the Great Migration northward. And to date, what we have been doing, as documented in the annual report you can download off our website at soulsgrowndeep.org, we've transferred over 300 artworks from our collection into the collections of 16 museums so far, from the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, both of whom, among many other museums, have had exhibitions of their acquisitions from us of late. And those acquisitions range from here in San Francisco at the De Young, a set of the Quilts of Gee's Bend, presentation in that same exhibition of material by Thornton Dial, showing the revelations of art in the African American South of the DeYoung Museum, which was June of 2017. And Mr. Dial and his son Richard Dial were instrumental in many ways for the foundation of our effort. The show at the Metropolitan Museum was graced with a banner and an opportunity to see these works presented alongside some of the great works in the permanent collection of the Met, including Mr. Dial's History Refused to Die, which gave the title of the exhibition. And like so many of his other assemblages, is testamentary of the conflict and racial inequities and challenges facing artists in the South in the era of Jim Crow and beyond. The High Museum in our collection's home in Atlanta put together in their permanent galleries exhibitions of Mr. Dial's work on the far left and the far right of this slide, alongside some other notable artists like Robert Rauschenberg. And it's that combination of work of artists across the 20th century of different backgrounds that's our aspiration. We want our collections to be melded and seen alongside other artists with the same degree of respect and honor and curiosity attached to them. Here, more recently, an exhibition still up in Richmond, Virginia, at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, where our board will be meeting next month, their acquisitions from us, and a show that just closed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art of their acquisitions as well. So these are a few of the 16 museums to date with which we've been working, but we anticipate over the next decade to be working with dozens more museums to distribute most of the some 1,000 works still in our holdings. And that will be both here in the US and abroad. Our curator is based in Paris, Raina Lampkins-Fielder, who is at work on working with museums in Europe to see objects from this collection. And as our director of collections, Scott Browning in Atlanta, is caring for these works when museums come to see them. So we're a wonderful team in 3 different cities with others attached in professional terms as fellows, interns, and of course, board members. What we hope to see happen is, in time, an acceptance of this work in ways that seep into the public consciousness. Mrs. Obama's portrait, which was unveiled to fanfare by Amy Sherald, is one in which she's wearing a dress by an American designer, Michelle Smith, where you see the inspiration for this dress are the quilts of Gee's Bend, which was mentioned here and there in the course of the unveiling of the portrait, but for us was a wonderful affirmation of the degree to which American art history is finding its way into the public consciousness. And among the projects we're involved in is a quilt trail in Gee's Bend, Alabama, setting up, with the help of Pentagram Design in New York, a new set of signs that both tell the stories of the quilt makers and the tradition, give access to visitors to understand the tradition, and begin to build sustainable cultural tourism and economic opportunities and jobs for people in the second poorest county in the United States, in Wilcox County, Alabama. We have a robust internship program, which this last year visited Joe Minter in Birmingham in his incredible African village, which is outside of his home. And it's an astonishing array in an art installation and environment of material that tells the history of 400 years of oppression and very powerful work. And Joe was in the Whitney Biennial this year, which is one of the older artists in it. But we're starting to see an awakening of interest among institutions in this work. So I'll close by saying on our website is a rather complete inventory of the hundreds of works that have gone into these museums, the story of who we've been after and helping, what we're trying to achieve, and I hope you'll turn to it at some point. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. That was amazing to see. Our final speaker, Kenji, has the distinction of being the youngest among us. He shared with me at lunch this afternoon. He is a Dartmouth class of 2013 alum. And just a little bit of introduction. I'm going to go really slowly here. Kenji Pryde, Praepipatmongkol, there we go, is a curator and historian of modern and contemporary Asian art. He recently held fellowships at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Tate Britain, the National Museum of Korea, and the Getty Foundation. He has worked on projects at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the National Gallery Singapore, and Bangkok Art and Cultural Center. He currently sits on advisory boards for several new museums under development in Thailand and is completing his PhD at the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Kenji to the podium.
Seems like there might be an issue here. Okay, there we go. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to echo what many other speakers have said and really thank the organizers of this conference, especially Kathy and John, for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure. And I just want to say that, coming to Dartmouth for me was eye-opening in many ways, in large part because I grew up in Bangkok without ever having really visited an art museum before. And then I came to the United States when I was 17, and the first museum I visited was the Met. And some people have told me it's all downhill from there. And I've had the privilege, of course, of working here at the Hood as an intern with Kathy Hart, with Juliet, with Amelia, and taking amazing courses with many of the art history faculty here. And what I like to reflect upon is this initial kind of statement, which is taken as a truism of what museums do in a way, and what I arrived at Dartmouth thinking museums do. But of course, what my Dartmouth education was about in a very real way was nuancing the statement, right? That what counts as human in the past has been dictated by matters of skin color and race. What counts as culture worth preserving depends upon elite taste and value. Whose posterity stands to be the beneficiary of the public trust, right, depends on societal hierarchies. And finally, what the preservation of culture means may not go hand in hand with supporting people's livelihoods. And that critical lens, of course, is something I gained here. All this is to say museums have a problematic history, we know that. But what is the promise of museums to posterity today? And that brings me to kind of the work that I've been doing, and I think there are kind of two lines of work that I've been doing. And the first of all is with kind of institutions in Euro-America, quote unquote, that are interested in kind of nuancing and expanding this kind of general notion of what museums do. But second of all, with institutions in Asia, primarily young museums, young private museums, they're really interested in kind of thinking of new models of what museums should do. And the title of the presentation, Museums Are Not for Posterity, comes from this essay by an Indian theater critic named Rustam Bharucha, who is writing about kind of all these new museum initiatives in Asia that are kind of designed with almost a deadline in mind, an endpoint in mind. And he writes, and I quote him, "We need to think of museums less as structures and locations or sites of less as structures or locations and more as phenomenologies of being. In other words, we need to think of how museums begin, unfold, tell stories, stimulate conversations, get into trouble, and then willfully and consciously die." And so I think I bring that up because I want to raise the question today about kind of how does diversity and inclusion relate to kind of fundamentally different ways that different generations think about the future and what that future means. And so I'll bring in a rather radical voice here, not on the topic of museums, but climate change, but we can relate that back to museums in a way. And I think what Thunberg represents here is the same kind of anger and resentment that I see museums now run up against today, right? Whether if that be calls for repatriation, calls to divest from certain kinds of investment, calls to remove board members, right? With the understanding somehow museums have failed the public in its promise. And what is the function of this kind of angry discourse, right? And many people have written this off as a kind of childish naivete. Others say it's a large but necessary dose of guilt or shame that those in power should feel because there's a deep misalignment about what we believe and what we do. And I think what Greta brings up usefully is the question of intergenerational equity, or this kind of concept of fairness and justice between generations. What do we owe the people in the past? What do we owe people in the future? And I think this is at the core of what museums do, of course, but that isn't necessarily explicitly thematized in terms of diversity and inclusion. And so in what ways, what are we doing today about righting the wrongs of the past, and how is it about creating the conditions of flourishing for generations to come? And I think these are separate but ultimately interrelated projects, right? And so I'll spend a little time kind of walking through some things that I've done in recent years. And this first project really comes from my time at Tate Britain, where they're very much invested, as many museums are, in rethinking how to present their permanent collection and present a more diverse narrative, say here of British post-war art history, and including kind of immigrant artists who were working in Britain and London at that time. And I was tasked at looking into acquiring the works of this artist, David Madea, Filipino-born artist who was working in London in the 60s. And what became quickly apparent is this acrimonious history between David and the Tate, as you can see from this little sliver of an excerpt from a letter that he wrote in 1971 here. And of course, I think that, the Tate is really trying to mend that relationship, now understanding that his art and his materials are very vital to British art history. But I think what this case presents is the time lag that's at play, right? That artists of Madea's generation are finally getting their due in museums today. And cases closer to home might be people like Fate Ringgold, like Hardina Pindell, like Martin Puryear, who are finally getting their due with major retrospectives. But in some ways, I think this, being at the Tate that time really raised other issues for me, because I was in a fellowship that was associated with an artist residency at the Delfina Foundation, which supports primarily artists from the Middle East and from North Africa. And when I was kind of testing out some of these ideas with my colleagues, artists at the residency, they were like, you can still write this letter today. That these are still in many ways the struggles of what a young artist of color still faces to be recognized by a major art institution. And so what does diversity and inclusion work mean, right? Does it mean that artists need to struggle for 30, 40, 50 years of their life in order to eventually be afforded that recognition at the end of their career, right? How is it that, the issues that David Madea faced in his youth still in many ways is the issues that youth today face? And of course, this is the heavily sanitized reconstruction of David Madea's bubble machines that is now in the Tate's collection. You can notice that the original version was really about kind of spewing these soap suds into the balcony and really out into the urban area. And now we have a museum security can't really deal with soap suds. So we have this. It's a close approximation. But I think that it's also kind of raises this point of kind of how, yes, diversity work and broadening the collection is great, but ultimately it needs to be sexy and safe, right? To use the words of a colleague, that there are still many parameters that we are beholden to. But what the proposal really for the Tate came down to is to think about kind of how how that this intergenerational frame allows us to think about honoring the legacy of an artist like Madea might entail not simply just bringing his work into the gallery, into the present, right, but bringing his practice and his convictions into the present. So Madea was somebody who was very much involved with a cohort of Latin American artists like Lygia Clark and Helio Otisika, who were present in London in the 60s and invested in an idea of third world internationalism in male art. And so really the proposal to kind of put Madea back into the heart of a display in Tate Britain, myself and several curators were also pushing for kind of the republication and reinterpretation of these older materials in a way that still speaks to kind of the issues that we're working with today in terms of third world internationalism, or how is it that we can find alternative ways of circulating art through mail or through, of course, today, the internet. Right? How am I doing on time here? And I just want to jump briefly to my work at the MCA Chicago, where I was curatorial fellow over the past year. And I arrived at the MCA at a time where there were kind of two major shows on the docket that were planned to coincide this summer. The first is a retrospective of Virgil Ablow, who's the head of Louis Vuitton's menswear, and you can see some of his designs on the bottom left, and he's generally kind of widely known as one of the very few Black designers at a Parisian couture house. And of course, on the top right, some of you might be familiar with these screenshots from Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message is Death, which kind of has been described as video montage of Black life in the 20th century set to Kanye's West, This Is a God Dream. And so I came into the institution in a moment when they were really thinking about kind of how to bring in a Black audience, but also how to engage the youth, right? And really the expectation was, of course, Virgil Ablow would bring in young people who would really line up around the block, perhaps for the show, but perhaps also for the Nike shoe drop, right? But we're happy with both. And so my task, which was to put together during my time as a fellow there, a show from the collection. And I thought that, in some ways, there is this kind of part of the MCA's DNA, which is about the institution as almost a religious or sacred space, and the museum as that. So the first show that opened the MCA's building in 1996 was called Negotiating Rapture. And of course, Arthur Jafa's video still has very prominently features kind of that gospel-inflected hymn. And so this was the show that I had helped put together with some colleagues called Fragments of a Crucifixion. And it really deals with kind of how contemporary artists are using Christian grammar and vocabulary to deal with the history of racial violence in this country. And of course, depictions of Christ and the crucifixion have long been used by American artists in moments where it seems that the future seems foreclosed and sacrifice seems to be, the sacrifice of Christ seems to secure the redemption of posterity, especially posterity of color. And so these are some shots from the show, but really what the show was trying to get at was to say, these are works from the collection that have been shown multiple times, but how do we bring in a new frame to talk about these works, right? And we made the decision that it would be disingenuous for the museum to try to insert a religious voice into the labels that would be the museum's voice. And what would it mean to kind of surface the religious perspective on certain works of art through the use of labels? And say, for instance, here you have a photograph of Emmett Till's grave by Jason Lazarus that is being paired with, of course, a quote from Emmett Till's mother. And what this brings up too is this kind of idea of how we can, really change what is a very masculine narrative of Christ the Redemptor to look at these other kind of ways in which his figure and his voice has been mediated particularly through mothers of children, of Black children who have lost their lives to violence in this country, right? And this is a theme that, really became the focus for several discussion groups that the museum convened with community partners, which are both kind of faith-based organizations and interfaith organizations in Chicago. So it was quite a new experience for the museum to be dealing with church groups and to be dealing with people who were coming in and looking at the show and not necessarily caring about the art historical context, but I was leading a group through the show, and there were people who were pointing at different works and saying, okay, this reminds me of this passage from the Gospel of Luke. And I think that speaks to kind of how, okay, contemporary art museums diversifying their collection isn't just about bringing artists of XYZ origin and skin color into this space, but really how do you bring other language into the space and other ways of valuing art into the space that really has, nothing to do with the market value or the reputation of these artists in most cases. Right? And I'd like to end with a project that I had helped to start at the MCA Chicago, which is a new partnership between the MCA and Tate Exchange at Tate Modern. And both institutions have been very much thinking about how to integrate community engagement and community co-created programming into museum spaces. And so the Tate, of course, had Tate Exchange, which is an entire floor in its new wing dedicated to that, and the MCA has the MCA Commons. And what this partnership is bringing together was, first of all, convening over the summer of 10 institutions around the country who are thinking about how community engagement work and community partnership work can function as almost a kind of internal institutional critique, right? That how is it that it's almost like a Trojan horse of bringing in really radical people from the outside straight into the heart of board meetings and museum leadership, right? And the convening we did earlier this summer was kind of how to upgrade that Trojan horse. So if any of you are interested more in that work, I would love to talk to you more about that. And I just like to kind of end with some questions which I have been thinking about a lot. And this first question, I think that both Max and Ellen have touched upon this idea that, to what extent is this diversity and inclusion work about art, and to what extent is it about the people? And how is it that museums can secure both intra and intergenerational cultural equity? And lastly, and this is a question I get a lot kind of talking to people working in kind of the community partnership realm, which is, are art museums even the best place to do this, right? And I think that's a question worth asking. Thank you so much.
For your presentations and for a kind of window into this big topic. And while I've prepared or consolidated a few questions that we've all talked about in preparation for this afternoon, I do want to at some point open it up for discussion. I know that this is a big subject and certainly one that a number of people have alluded to wanting to unpack in different ways. So, but first, a couple of questions that we've been thinking, and I don't even know where to begin, but something that we talked about earlier is with regard to cultural and operational shifts that we've seen in museums and in institutions through your presentations. What do you think we can do to go beyond the examples that we've already discussed today. We've looked at collections, we've looked at programming, we've looked at exhibition making. Is there an area of museum work we haven't touched upon?
We haven't talked very much about programming, I guess. And I will shout out to all the educators who do that hard work. I am by no means an expert. I feel like I just got here. So I only have my own experience and kind of conversational knowledge with my colleagues to draw from. But I think what, for me being in a college art museum, I was doing all my own programming. And because I had intellectual control over the content I was creating, it was on me to invest the care in ensuring that the programming could fill the gaps that an exhibition can't perform. So that happens differently at the ICA, where the education department oversees the programming and the curatorial department oversees what goes on the walls. And I think what I observed there is a division of labor, and this has to do with, I think, how many larger institutions are structured in a kind of hierarchical way with different departments, and in terms of how we can generate robust programming that connects the content in the galleries to its activation, the activation of its ideas in programming that actually connects with the public and builds something bigger. That requires more interdepartmental conversation. It requires more shared authorship. And something that Lonnie Bunch calls for in this 2000 essay is more kind of cross-platform, kind of committee-based planning for exhibition ideas and programming, because you want as many voices at the table as possible. And if you have 4 curators working on a project, you might not be asking all the questions that you need to. So that really actually doesn't have much to do with programming, it's more about operations, but that's just one way I'm thinking about this. And 2, the one thing that I did want to address that does get to your question is in many cases, I think when museums are making new hires or they're trying to defend the work that they don't feel that they can do in terms of a diverse practice, they often fall back on lack of curatorial expertise. And I don't understand why it should be the onus of a single curator to have an expertise in a method of thinking about the world that touches everything and every area. So I think, shifting some of the, sharing more of the responsibility and doing the learning that we need to do to expand our expertise is a really important facet of future museum education and ongoing education.
I think, do you have
I was just going to add that I think a lot of the conversations that we've had on museum inclusion diversity is about expanding the room at the table and who has a seat at the table and who has a voice. But I think what a lot of community engagement work shows is that it's not just about who is at the table, but it's about how that dialogue takes form, right? What is the form of that dialogue and how is that being moderated? And I think that there's oftentimes this perception that if you bring in people who are really radically different from you, then the dialogue will just devolve because there's no common ground with which to find room, to find a solution. And I think this is where some of my experience was in thinking about how training in interfaith dialogue or ecumenical dialogue and these ways of, really bridging radical difference, actually has a place in museum settings where so much of the time we don't really know how to talk about these tough issues.
I actually have 2 questions that I think I'm going to consolidate into one because they're somewhat related. Something that we addressed in preparing is how do we know that diversity work will continue into the future, beyond this moment where it's certainly top of mind for most institutions, but how do we make the kinds of shifts that Ellen is describing in order to ensure that this work continues, and what types of reward systems might accelerate the diversification of museums? How do we incentivize this shift?
Yeah, I wrote an essay a few years ago called Metrics of Success in Art Museums, and it was predicated on asking, how do you know if you're doing well? Which is a question most museums answer when they do strategic planning, and then they put the plan on the shelf and they hysterically look at it when it's almost over, saying, did we do it? Did we finish it? And instead, I think that assessment of success is critical throughout the life of the organization and in every way, in every board meeting and every staff meeting. Because unless there's common agreement between governance and management and the public about what a museum is out to achieve, then you're going to have a fractious result. And as somebody who was born in the late 50s, marched against the war in the 60s, I'm very comfortable with nonviolent protest. I understand its value, and I think social media has very much altered the conversation in museum management and in boardrooms. And in respect to that, I think it's a positive shift to begin to have open discussion about how you measure success in ways that are unfamiliar to museums largely, but are becoming more normative and are therefore to the point when I put an artist seat on the board of the Whitney, everyone turned their head to hear, well, what does the artist think about this? And it was such an obvious thing. I'd had the same in Toronto at the Art Gallery of Ontario. We had 4 artists on the board. That's how you have real dialogue. That's how you begin to see change effectuated. That's how you see the culture of an institution shift, how the staff suddenly finds their own voice in a way that's not commensurate with the inherited culture and politics of the institution, and how the public begins to realize that some form of criticism is essential.
I'm chime in something. One thing that I think is really important to understand about diversity is that it's a real pain to define. And in many of our strategic planning documents, we define it. It takes hard work. And it's also something that's very contemporary. If diversity is intended to be a measured reflection of your audience, that is going to change in a month. And you're going to have to adjust your parameters. And so I think understanding that diversity can't be some sort of ideal that we all strive for to be on the right side of things, but instead is something that we are constantly negotiating with and reestablishing key priorities for ourselves is important. And in many ways, museums can do that through exhibitions. They can do that through programming or special content that they offer. But I think it's important to think about it not just as a kind of a bucket you have to have over here in your institution that you never have to revisit again, because it's ongoing and malleable work.
I think to that shift, our next question about the change in collection priorities feels right. If a work is being deaccessioned now because it falls outside of a collecting focus, as you talked about, audiences shifting, how do we ensure that the margins of today don't become the redundancies of the future? Will we look back and question those deaccessions in a few decades?
Absolutely. That's why deaccessioning should proceed with caution, because the taste and judgment and perspective about what some curator a long time ago thought was important might well come back around. And we've seen this happen in a variety of fields of art history. Bouguereau was despised in the 80s, and suddenly by the late 90s, early 2000s, he was a darling of collectors. And that has begun to make itself manifest. I think the recent deaccessioning programs that you mentioned at SF MoMA and the Art Gallery of Ontario and Baltimore all have different perspectives. I mean, in San Francisco, there's a lot of money. There are a lot of people who could be writing checks to buy art. It's not so true in Baltimore. So I don't know that that's a valve that needs to be opened at all times and people to look at in respect to collection change. But I would say that deaccessioning cannot be a solution to the problem we're discussing. It shouldn't be. It's not wasn't intended to be a collection that was monetized and turned into commercial assets, which is a risk that museums face that's really severe. So I would hope that there are other strategies in terms of affluent people writing checks and getting tax deductions, which has worked reasonably well for the last 100 years, and we jeopardize it at our peril by treating works of art as commodities, because the IRS will only too happily say, that's a commercial transaction, that's taxable. So we have to be careful about what we're doing.
I mean, I think that the question, the question speaks to what we've been discussing, which is the inherent latency of diversity work too. And maybe the Warhols that the BMA deaccessions that they consider to be redundant or perhaps minor works are actually going to turn out to be among the most interesting that scholars begin to think about and revisit later on. But that's, again, I am no expert in deaccessioning, but it's very it's thoughtful work. It doesn't happen easily, and so I think that it's a risk to take. It involves a lot. Leveraging your collection is a pretty strong and I think brave position to take, but it has to come alongside a broader commitment, because that's not something that you want to do every few years.
So with that, I would love to open up to questions, and yeah, please wait for, there's 2 microphones going around.
Thank you all for a very informative panel. In focusing on the word inclusion, what do you think museums need to do or should be doing to include more women in their collections?
Like, besides buy the work of women artists?
That's obvious, but why aren't they? There's, clearly there needs to be more done in terms of when you think about deaccession. Do they then say, in terms of we need to have more representation of women? Why isn't there more representation of women? We were talking about this last night. Certainly a lot of it comes down to donations, right, which historically is oriented towards more male artists. But in terms of acquisition funding, should museums be more proactive in saying, look,
like, should they earmark
donations, we get enough sort of male artists. Should we be more proactive in purchasing? How do museums, I guess, then become more proactive to purchasing? Why aren't they being more proactive in purchasing women artists? And, of all periods of time.
Well, in my time at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, I actually was part of the launch of a council called the Artemis Council, which is a museum affinity group that was dedicated specifically to what you're talking about. It was started by Lisa Phillips, who's been director of the New Museum for about 20 years or more. The Artemis Council, like any other acquisitions committee, makes annual donations to the museum, and those funds are aggregated not only, in this case, not for acquisitions, because the New Museum is not currently and actively growing its collection, but to support exhibitions, publications, and residencies of women artists. I think maybe 5 years ago, she asked herself the same question, and I think with anything at an institution, priorities are often set by what there are resources to support, and there was a strong feeling that if there were dedicated funds to this work, there would be no way to deny it. And so year over year, there's a significant pool of money to either completely underwrite a monographic exhibition of a woman artist, or to support the commission of new work for a major group exhibition at the museum. And I'd say Artemis is probably in its 5th year at this point and done some pretty dynamic work, presenting exhibitions like that of Pipolati Rist, Sarah Lucas, and others, as well as publishing that goes alongside those exhibitions.
I'm just thinking through your question, and I think it gets to this broader issue of, do we need advocacy groups for specific demographics, right? And I think that becomes both, a very important thing to create momentum and acceleration, but at the same time that ties it to availability of capital, right? And I think I see this most clearly, I mean, not so much with advocating for women artists per se, but for artists from specific regions of the world, right? That then the advocacy for that is tied to the ability to fundraise from that region.
Yeah, I also think shame is a wonderful motivator. And ArtNet studied last year on diversity in collections in terms of African American artists, artists of color in general, absolutely had an impact on the conversation. And their more recent 2019 study on women in collections is, I think, having the same kind of impact of the sort you're pointing out. Happily, increasingly museums are being led by women, including our own National Gallery of Art now. And the curators who are most exciting in the field are often women. And I think this change needs support, needs funds, needs advocacy on the board level, among the staff and the public and the press. And I think it's starting, but I think you're right to call it out.
I have one more thing to add on that level, which is that at the ICA we are blessed to have an amazing trustee who is a visionary collector, Barbara Lee, who when the ICA constructed, the ICA has been around for most of the 20th century, but kind of a roving architectural presence until we built the existing building in 2006. And when that happened, we began a collection for the first time. So her foundational gift, which was all works by women artists, comprises a significant portion of our collection and ensures that at any given moment we have at least 60% women artists in our collection. So the significance of cultivating visionary leadership on a board, but then also that board member understanding the impact of their gift. I think maybe to your question about gifting and squaring up the impact of a gift that is very focused in its nature is another way to do that work.
I would just add that the majority of the women of the 160 artists in our foundation are women, so museums need to keep acquiring from us too.
More of a comment, but just to build onto that, just to say that I think scholarship is so critical, and to tie it back to the Hood, what the Hood is doing as a teaching institution of having, and as one who works with more historical material, having PhD candidates looking at women artists, looking at artists of color, looking at artists that maybe have been overlooked. And it really resonated with me what you said, Max, that there were only 20 artists maybe that everyone's going after, but there's a whole wide world out there of other people who are ready to be discovered and that eventually will make their way into collections. Yes, I hope so, absolutely amazing. Eventually will be the subject of exhibitions and programming, but it's almost starting earlier, the research, uncovering them, going back to material we thought we knew, and finding those really rich stories. And I'm going to circle back to my mantra of the conference, which is paid internships and building pipelines so that there are people who are excited to discover this material, that are choosing to enter our field and are being given a seat at the table, and eventually will become patrons themselves, eventually will join boards, et cetera, but that are choosing to become art historians. It's so critical that we expand diversity in our field. So I'm so excited about all these amazing alums that are here, and I hope we can go out and train the next generation.
Well, she's pointing over there.
Oh, go ahead. You have the mic.
Well, thank you. This has been, the whole conference has been wonderful, and it's so thrilling to hear you all speak. And I saw the Quilts of G's Ben years and years ago. My mother's a quilter. It was a wonderful show. And of course, Ellen and Kenji, you do us so proud. But my question is, and I think it's something that's implicit in all of your presentations, and maybe made a little more explicit just in Kenji's because he used the word, but in academia, right, where we've had these sort of diversity campaigns, right, we've become quite skeptical of the word just because it has become such a corporate mantra, a quota system that often leaves untouched the structural conditions that reproduce the forms of privilege and exclusion that we're continuing to sort of talk about. And so we tend to talk more now, or sort of ask, can we subs out equity, right? What happens if you change the conversation, use the word equity rather than the word diversity, which has perversely become a weird way in which white conservative men are saying, I'm underrepresented in the academy, therefore I should be part of this system. So I'm wondering if it's an invitation for all of you to just expand a bit more on, or to address, if you will, the utility of the terms inclusion and diversity at this moment in our time, and simultaneously, what is different when you think about equity as opposed to, or even justice, as opposed to merely sort of expanding the people sitting around the table.
I have a two-pronged response. The first is a Beyonce lyric, "Pay Me in Equity," which is just about redistributing the resources of the museum in a way that proves your investment. An example of this is we just organized a major exhibition on the topic of migration at the ICA Boston, and we're working with a local artist to help us focus these conversations and deliver impact with our local communities, because it is, as you know, a very global topic. And he felt very strongly that he wanted to focus on redistributing the resources that the museum was giving him, both in terms of the platform that he had access to and opportunities to pay people in the community to help do that work. And so I think acknowledging the labor of diversity work when you're asking community members to participate is really important. And he developed a series of legal literacy workshops that he partnered with Northeastern Law School to organize, and everyone's getting paid. And he is working with East Boston across the harbor from the ICA to really try to create a sustained investment in the community. So thinking about the monetary consequences of using the term equity is important. And then I'll give another example of equity in terms of just like seeing who's being ignored. A lot of times conversations around diversity, we're not talking at all about, diversity has an optics. And we often don't think about those who don't look like they represent diversity. And when I had the opportunity to organize a show at Bowdoin, I had my ear to the ground about a lot of conversations that were happening on campus, many of which circled around racial representation and discomfort that many students of color felt at that institution. But then there is also this burgeoning conversation around disability and access, and the fact that some students couldn't actually enter a building to take classes because there weren't facilities in place. And the institution is very slow to respond to these kinds of demands. And so I was able to use the museum as a platform and use my role to bring their voices into the exhibition content and to integrate in its programming that could encompass these topics, to create a framework that can stretch and flex. And so I think also when it comes to developing content and frameworks, like being able to, if you are at a monolithic, very slow-moving institution, be able to create frameworks that enable you to be flexible even if it feels like you can't be.
Yeah, I'll just say we're very active in working with the Artists' Rights Society to propel the potential for commercial licensing by the artists who we represent. And we advocate a bill that Representative Nadler introduced, the Artist Resale Royalty Act, which would, for the first time, we'd be one of 80 countries that finally has a resale royalty for works of art that would benefit artists on the sale of subsequent sale, not just the first sale of their work. But also we're working to get the work of handicraft workers in the Deep South to market, and a platform working closely with a nonprofit organization to give them economic opportunity. For us, equity starts with the artist's paycheck and moves on from there.
I just want to echo Max that I think equity really highlights socioeconomic equity, right? And that's kind of often missing out in discussions on diversity. And I bring this up, I recently had a conversation with the art gallery in NYU Abu Dhabi, which is doing great work there. But the question of diversity is kind of a moot point for them, right? Because their student body is de facto already extremely diverse, at least in terms of ethnicity and race, right? And so it really shifts the question towards, equity in terms of who has the access and the financial resources, right, to not just consume art, but I think also this is another key point I want to raise is the inequities between curators and artists, right? So or museum administrators versus artists, right? Because I think in some ways I'm here in a very privileged position where I've been in a PhD program for 7 years and have relatively had to done very little to get the financial support that I get, compared to, say, young artists of my age who are out there and, spending hundreds of dollars applying for artist residencies, doing artist residencies that pay very little and don't have health insurance, right? So I think it really is a question, too, of, yes, we need to produce more art historians and curators who do this good work, but how do we also change the structure on the other side and say, the cultural producers who really are the ones doing the work, how do they get supported, right? And I think, Max, you bring up a great point.
We're out of time, aren't we?
I think we have time for maybe just one more.
Thank you all so much. This was fantastic. I wanted to ask, I think in these questions about equity, inclusion, diversity, we wind up talking so frequently about artists, so exhibitions and collecting, programming, and then often curatorial staff. And I'm going to put aside the staff of all the other labor in the museum for a minute, which is also really important. But what we don't talk that much about, and it has bubbled up a little bit in each of your talks, but is our patronage, our boards, and our donors. So I was wondering if you could all speak a little bit to that and how these issues, how you're all thinking about these issues at that level and how they do or don't further the work that we're all trying to do.
Well, that's an important one, and certainly been, I think, in the news quite a bit. I think a number of the major foundations across the country are thinking quite a lot about board diversity. And in my specific work over the last 2 years, it's something that has come up. As John mentioned, I'm currently working for a nascent institution that's 2 years old. It's in South Africa, and I think we could spend a whole panel just talking about that. The context there obviously is very different than working here in the US, and they are in a period, a post-apartheid period, where the kind of equity and transformation that we're talking about here is actually mandated by legislation. So, these kinds of conversations are very different when you're in an environment that the government requires change, as opposed to sort of brainstorming ways we can change. But that said, this nascent museum, which has come about through a public and private partnership, is thinking about its longevity, like as we all do, and looking to US-based foundations that work internationally for support. And something that has come up, to be perfectly candid, over the last 2 years in approaching those foundations is that our founding board doesn't reflect the kind of transformation that is so important in South Africa. And it's something that we are working at present to remedy, because our mission is absolutely one that is focused on the continent and its diaspora. Our staff is incredibly diverse, certainly more diverse than most museums in America, but our leadership, our ownership, our founders don't reflect that kind of transformation. So it's something that we're thinking about constantly, and I think we probably face similar challenges, to institutions here in the States. To the extent that boards support institutions and that formerly disaffected populations in South Africa do not have the kind of wealth or have not had the opportunity to amass the kind of wealth that it would take to make philanthropic gifts. How do you do that? How do you cultivate that kind of support locally as well as internationally?
It all starts with the nominating committee. The nominating committee chair in our case is Jackie Serwer, who until just a few weeks ago was the chief curator of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So With Jackie, I've never had any problems identifying trustees who are on the side of what needs to happen. So.
One more? I see another hand here. I think that we might run out of time after this.
Thank you. Obviously, this is a very interesting. Obviously, this is a very interesting and topical question, but I want to particularly commend all of you on staying within time limit when you were giving your speeches, which allowed for a lot more interactions from here. I see you, and I recognize it. Thank you. But I want to come back to the last question that Kenji, can I call you Kenji, asked, which was whether museums are even the place to deal with this problem. And I'm curious to see what he and the rest of you have to say to this. And I'm asking this because, I mean, obviously museums dealing with diversity is good, it's important, but when you look at the nature of the problem, the nature of the situation, it's something that is very congruent with things that are happening outside of the quote-unquote art world, because the art world exists in the world and follows the way the world is reflected. And the way racial problems manifest themselves in class problems or income problems, or when you brought up the question of women, the first thing I thought about was Linda Novich's essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, in 1971, and we are still asking that question now in 2019. And so I'm just wondering whether this problem can even be fixed from here, or whether museums have to sort of redefine themselves to be in lockstep, if it's possible, even with the working class, when even the world we live in is not very friendly towards the survival of the working class writ large. And so are we fighting a battle that we will be fighting forever if we are fighting from within the museum? Is there something museums can solve themselves?
So thank you for that. That is a very good question and something that I think really needs to be addressed in terms of, you know, what is the location of quote unquote this work of diversity, inclusion, equity. And I guess I'm going to bring up two anecdotes. And first of all is the convening that I mentioned at the MCA with kind of people working in community partnerships. And we were going around and asking kind of how do you define the success of your work, right? And one of the curators slash community programmers from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Puerto Rico said, you know, I define success when the time comes that I no longer have to do what I do, right? And that is to say, you know, she's working in a context where the museum is being forced to basically provide basic kind of art education and services that really the state should be providing, right? And success there, you know, really means like, hey, this work doesn't need to be done in art museums anymore, that somebody else actually takes up the reins, right? I think that's one way to think about it, is that museums are in some ways almost a stopgap measure, right? That it's yes, as stodgy and inflexible as museums can be, it can also be flexible and take on these other roles because art touches everything, right? And another way I think of thinking through that question is kind of what the whole issue of repatriation raises, right? Which is to say that the argument against repatriation, one argument against repatriation is that, you know, the destination locations don't necessarily have institutions to support the continued preservation of XYZ cultural heritage object, right? And so the question then becomes, you know, do we need art museums to do that work, right? Or what other models of institutions are available? And I think that's not a question that anybody probably has an answer to right now.
Yeah, thank you all.
What a great question to end this this convening. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined us, and really thank you very much to all of these speakers who've put out and given so generously of their thoughts and their time. I invite you upstairs now for a reception to say thank you to all of our speakers. The galleries will be open till 5:30. It's a little extra time, and at 5:30 we'll have comments because today is also the opening celebration for Art for Dartmouth, celebrating the 250th, which is an installation of gifts of art to the museum that are on view in the galleries right now. So please join us upstairs, and thanks again to all of our speakers.